All right, what's up, guys? Today, what I wanted to do, and I know I'm getting this out one day late, was this is a video specifically designed to look at, making sure the volume's good, specifically designed to look at alt cycles. So to kind of start, just to walk you guys through an outline of how I want to go over this, I kind of want to do a quick study of the previous alt cycles, and then really kind of the biggest takeaways from those, things to understand in terms of valuation, in terms of exposure, and then past that, kind of lessons. I know a couple of guys talked about that on, what are the kind of the biggest takeaways from that, how to best seize an opportunity in this alt season, if this is an alt season, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit, and then also how to manage risk once we do get kind of towards the tail end, right? I think that's what most people are worried about is, obviously as alts rise, everyone can make gains simply by holding, but kind of what is that turning point? How are you best both not eliminating, the upside, but also reducing risk as things do lose their value? So I want to kind of start with a quick study of alt cycles, what I used to look for with Bitcoin, and still do, and then also kind of ETH real quick, a real quick review. I think everyone understands the ETH channel, but it's kind of now I think this alt cycle or this kind of situation that we're in right now is definitely a little bit different, right, than kind of the previous little alt session we had. So using ETH and a few other alt examples are going to be really nice. And then at the very end, kind of takeaways or lessons and how I'm preparing for this alt cycle, what I'm going to be doing slightly different, and how we can kind of best capitalize on it. Because you hear so many different approaches, so many different things. At least you're going to take my takeaways and things we'll be watching going forward. So to quickly start, I broke down this Bitcoin chart, and these colorings mean a few things. So looking back at probably the clearest and longest alt cycle that we've had, I would also say cleanest technically, was back here beginning of 2017. So this one started when Bitcoin was valued low, and this is probably the most similar to what we're seeing right now. So I think this one has particular relevance. So if we're looking at the beginning of 2017, Bitcoin starts low, and even in an uptrend, as Bitcoin kind of gets to its top, this was really the peak. This right here was really the peak for alts. And this was June of 2017. If you want to see what that looks like for alts, just so we can kind of compare them side by side, I also marked it here. The beginning of that alt cycle for ETH back in 2017 was down here. And for both of these channels, both Bitcoin and ETH, I think everyone understands this, but this is kind of the cheapest or weakest alts. That's just like the simplest explanation I can give there, right? So that trend line. So that's when alts were cheapest. You can see ETH trend up all the way until June, right? So that's kind of the top of that alt season. It was really a 6-month kind of season, a 6-month trend where this is only showing ETH, but all alts, if you look at really across the board at any single chart, I'll use a couple other alts throughout this video to kind of explain it a little bit more. Whoops. You can see alt cycle starting back here. Actually, Edgeless isn't old enough. Anyways, you guys get the point, especially with ETH. So that's kind of the first alt cycle. I think that one's the most relevant to where we are right now. But before I kind of get into the one right now, I want to look at the past ones as well. So after June of 2017, we trended down for about 3 months, I guess you could say. There's kind of a brief reset period. So June was kind of when things topped out, right? And what we used to look for in 2017, and this is kind of what I studied the most last year, and spent the most time kind of charting and looking at, was timing when alts had the best chance of popping. Because quite honestly, alts actually performed pretty well really until about the end of June, pretty much, right? So there was a period... So there's a period after kind of the end or the peak of alts where some alts continued to run. And what I studied the most last year and what I really drilled on and was trying to understand and how I could time alt pops a lot was right when Bitcoin kind of had the best chance, since all alts, 95% of alts are only liquid in Bitcoin. Understanding the Bitcoin market is still the most important in my opinion. So since they're priced in Bitcoin, as Bitcoin's value rises, that has to push, if they keep the same dollar value, that has to push the alt pair down, right, in Bitcoin price terms. So kind of the timing mechanism last year, and not so much for this alt cycle, but definitely for these next few, was right when Bitcoin had the biggest chance of not continuing to move up, right? Because if it moves up too quickly, it's just like a pendulum. If your alt A is $10 and Bitcoin is valued at $3,000, if Bitcoin goes up to 5K, your alt in Bitcoin terms needs to be cheaper if it's still going to be $10, right? Just a really simple example. So the timing last year was whenever Bitcoin has kind of the best chance of hitting this resistance, alts could kind of really pop because Bitcoin wouldn't rise anymore. All that money was still in the system and it would flow back into alts. So we'd see the Bitcoin pairing, as Bitcoin pulled back a little bit off of kind of resistance, that's when you'd really see alts pop and you'd kind of get like the last pump there. So past that, there was a downtrend for, around 3 or 4 months. And this is really when the downtrend started, right back in June. And then there was one more brief period where alts really had another pop. And exact same thing that I just talked about here. This only occurred because Bitcoin hit the top of the channel, hit this major resistance, had a pullback, and what did all those alts do? They finally weren't getting suppressed by a stronger Bitcoin. Barring that nothing else changed in the situation, money could flow back out of Bitcoin and into alts. Or even if money didn't flow either way, as Bitcoin drops a little bit or stops rising, it gave alts a chance to breathe. So that was a really brief period. And then alts generally trended down really until about December. So once again, just reviewing on the ETH channel, what that looked like. So ETH and most other alts, rising to the top of that channel. This was the top of the alt trend in June, like we talked about, kind of the end of June. And then they have one more kind of move up here. This is really where like the last kind of little signs of life, last little pumps we were getting until September. All right, so just looking at where that is one more time on the Bitcoin chart so you can see what I mean. There's kind of one last little move from alts. Past that, they really, really trended down for that next 3 months, almost straight down until December. And this is the end of last year. So this is early December when they popped again. So now this is kind of, this abbreviated alt cycle that we just had was way more similar to kind of the move we were getting in September, the move at the end of June, than a normal or kind of the typical alt season last year. Right? So kind of the typical alt season that started in beginning of 2017 was, Bitcoin's valued very low and the entire kind of market rises together. The one that the abbreviated alt cycle that we just had that started in December or beginning of 2017 and only lasted for a month is much more like that September pop, right? It's when Bitcoin kind of was valued as expensive as it had ever been, right? But as it drops down, as it kind of faces resistance and stops suppressing alts, there's all this money still flowed into the crypto asset space, into the asset class. And as Bitcoin takes a step back, the alts and their Bitcoin pairings could really take off. So that lasted, really until the decline got steep. You can see how similar this is, right? Alts performing really well as Bitcoin makes kind of its initial move down. Once the move gets too steep, right? This is when alts got pushed down, kind of severely again, right? So this abbreviated alt cycle that we just had at the end of 2017 and beginning of this year is much more similar to kind of that September little pump we had, right, than a full alt season. Because the full alt season, contrary to a lot of people's belief, is Bitcoin and ETH and all alts actually can rise together, right? And they really did for that 2017 alt season. So things can get a little abstract when using kind of Bitcoin as a guide for what ETH and alts are going to do. I like to do it anyways. I still like to kind of study this and understand how Bitcoin's valued and kind of how we can use this to time alts. I think it's definitely still helpful, but it's clear that it's a variable. Alts can do well when Bitcoin is at its most expensive and it pulls back. Alts can also do well when Bitcoin's at its almost cheapest and continues to rise. So kind of the clearest way going forward, if we're really going to try to time alt season or really understand if this is an alt season or if alts are going to continue to trend higher, I think the ETH channel is probably the most helpful. The reason I'm saying that is regardless of what Bitcoin or really anything else is doing, looking at how ETH and alts are valued really in Bitcoin terms is always going to be pretty consistent, right? So, and not only just ETH, if we look at Edgeless or Cloak is another really good example. There's tons of pairs that kind of go through. You could also use Mu. A lot of these Bittrex coins, and I'm only using the Bittrex coins, guys, because they're old enough to really show kind of full cycles, right? So here's another great example. Beginning of the alt cycle, back here, Mu, 2017, up to really the top, right? In June 2017, and then we trend all the way down, kind of the last pump here in September or so. We trend all the way back down until this abbreviated alt cycle, right? So we have the abbreviated alt cycle, get to the top, and now we're back down kind of at the beginning, really, of where this abbreviated alt cycle started. So if we're looking kind of at the beginning of ranges, I know that 2017 one started a little bit lower. If we're looking at kind of the beginning of alt cycles, or don't even have to think about it in terms of alt cycles. If we're just looking at where cheap, only thinking in terms of valuations, this is where kind of moves have begun for alt seasons. And whether or not that trend continues, whether or not, it lasts for only a month, or whether it's the 6-month alt season, this level in terms of valuation is what matters the most, right? That's been consistent for every alt season. When alts reach kind of their all-time lows, I know this one isn't its all-time low, but when alts do reach kind of their beginning of alt season support, wherever that is, on some coins it's an all-time low, on some coins it's a range low. Edgeless is kind of the other example I was going to use. When I thought I had this chart ready. You know what I mean? This is also the beginning, once again, of that abbreviated alt cycle. So this is kind of the full alt cycle. Exact same thing with Mu. This is kind of where we can get to in a full 6-month alt cycle. This is where we can kind of get to on a 1 or 2-month alt cycle. The thing that remains consistent, both for ETH and all other alts, is the support or kind of beginning of alt cycle level is almost the same for every alt cycle, right? And we only have enough data across the alt season or across the alt scene to really only study a couple of these seasons, right? But consistently for the past few alt seasons or the past few alt cycles, that support has been the same, and a lot of alts are still really close to that support, right? So I still think they're valued extremely attractively. That's kind of the consistent thing studying and looking back at different alt seasons. So I wanted to kind of start with a brief history of that before we kind of went into things. Takeaway is Bitcoin can definitely be in different spots. Alts can perform and can outperform and have that alt cycle, whether or not Bitcoin is very expensive, the most expensive it's been, or kind of the cheapest and also at the beginning of a trend, right? So just wanted to really start with that. And then past that, kind of the lessons or the takeaways from, I'm going to go to ETH now, from those last alt cycles and kind of how to apply or what I'm applying this alt cycle. So now that we kind of understand what's consistent for every alt cycle is that they're, valued at the bottom of that support, the bottom of whatever you want to call it, alt season support. Kind of my biggest takeaways are 3 takeaways going into this alt season. It's particularly interesting now that we've had that pullback yesterday across the board kind of for alts and a bit of a shakeout as well for Bitcoin. 3 things that I'm looking for here, guys. One is holding less coins. And I talk about this a little bit in principles. This is a different approach than maybe some other people have in the space, but this is truly what has helped me, both honestly in the downturn for alts and really in the uptrend for alts. When I've done a lot better, it's really is when I'm only in 1 to 4 kind of trades what I want to be in. Right now I'm in maybe 1 to 5. Right? So really holding less coins. And that's the reason that's so tough to do. And I think the reason that so few people do it is because when you're looking across Twitter, when you're looking across Telegrams or Discords, there are so many opportunities. I mean, there's some accounts that post 4 entries a day and say, I'm buying here, check out this alt setup, check out this breakout. Even for me, and I'm here all day and can literally chart everything and set as many alerts as I want, for me to manage all of those trades, if I'm moving into 2 or 3 coins a day, it's almost impossible, right? And especially when coins dip like they did yesterday, or when coins are kind of hitting their targets, cycling through 4 exchanges, having to take profits on 30 or so coins, being able to track if it's at the key support, for me, I've found that's almost impossible, right? And then I lose conviction to half the setups. When everything dips, maybe I jump out of a few that really dipped hard. For me, I've just found that doesn't work. So really staying in kind of a fewer number of coins. And if you're in a bunch of coins, I'm not telling you to close all your positions. I'm just saying, you can make these changes going forward, right? Or apply them if you want to. You definitely don't have to. So for me, number one, holding less coins and being focused on those 3 or 4, right? And that's just in my trading portfolio. There's definitely things I have smaller bags kind of set aside. And there's one kind of difference I'll talk about in terms of the small caps I'm holding. But really for trades, focusing on those 3 or 4, and that's it for me. So 3 or 4 or 5. The second one is moving slow and taking profits. And I talk about moving slow so much, I'm sure it actually bothers some people, how much I say that. But what I'm really talking about, and I mean it, I think the alt cycles really illustrate it, is I really think that even if you are a trader in this space, an investor, whatever you want to call yourself, the real win is by kind of catching the bigger trend, right? So, even if alt 2X's in a month or 3X in a month, that's incredible, right? And you can realize those profits, and those are big profits. The real win kind of comes from riding, the bigger trend. So even if kind of you get in a little bit late on the bigger trend and get out kind of maybe even close to the top or kind of scale out on the way, that type of win is still what? That's like a 7, 8X, right? And even the same thing kind of for this abbreviated alt cycle, it's 3 or a 4X, and this is for ETH. Most other alts did, much higher, right? So moving slow and taking profits, right? And really understanding kind of the bigger trend. So both in terms of when we add, think times like yesterday, times like today, now we're going to be looking at all these opportunities to add into coins, moving slow, and then also taking profits. So I think this is kind of the one thing that this is kind of why I think people in the group want to go over this, and I think a lot of people want to always study alt cycles, is how do I know when to get out, right? How do I know when this is a little bit too crazy, I should be taking profits, and if I wait too long, all my profits are going to evaporate. The way that I do that, and it's not as clear with the ETH chart, I think something like Mu, it's a little bit more clear. I have these scribbles everywhere. Right, so something like Mu, it's a little bit more clear, guys. I'm not just talking about Mu, but it's just a very kind of clear illustration of previous alt cycles here. So if we're looking at Mu, and this is representative of almost all other alts, it's probably the cleanest way that I can do this, right? If we're looking at kind of where, the longest, a 6-month alt cycle has really peaked out, right? When alts are at their all-time highs that they're ever been at. Right, and we can never know that another trend won't break that all-time high and we move even higher. But this is just all we have for data points. Right, so if this is the all-time high for alts up here in June, and this is kind of what a 2-month alt cycle looks like, you can tell what all-time high in alts is. Very clear, and you can see this across the board in other alts as well, if they're old enough, that is. So if this is kind of this is overvalued, that's what I'm going to call that. I'm going to call this really expensive. This is where you should definitely be taking profits, almost reducing total exposure in alts. This is where, after a 2-month alt cycle, I think you should also be kind of less exposed to alts, kind of winding out of them, maybe closer to kind of, if I want to be aggressive in alts down here, I want to be almost completely out of alts here. I think you kind of want to be at, maybe at least halfway phased out. And that's going to be different for everyone. Some people's risk tolerance is they want to be in 100% alts right now. Some people's risk tolerance, they're only comfortable being in 3 to 4 pairs. They'd rather hold Bitcoin, right? Some of that's going to differ in terms of your belief system and what you're comfortable kind of holding. I think holding alts in general is definitely more risky, right? But there's more upside. So if we're just looking at it in terms of valuation, as we move through an alt cycle, and each pair is going to be a little bit different, right? But, this is kind of the top of alts, and this is when you want to be phasing out. This is definitely kind of also when I would say at least halfway phased out, whatever your allocation is. If usually you hold 50% alts, maybe start shifting down to 20 or 30% alts by the time we kind of get down here, right? And let the rest run. If you're very aggressive, continue to let them run. I think as long as, in terms of when to move and when to take profits, I think the only thing you really need to understand, and then you can make the decision yourself, is exposures. So being long alts, right? Or if you're holding, let's say, Doge against Bitcoin, and you're holding that and 4 other trades, if you are holding an alt, right, you are long the alt and short Bitcoin. So kind of, there's a few pendulums. You move cash into Bitcoin, Bitcoin into alts. At the top of every single cycle, whether it's the top of the Bitcoin cycle, whether it's the top of the alt cycle, you eventually want to take that money back out of alts into Bitcoin and then move some of that Bitcoin back into cash. Right? So cash being the safest, Bitcoin probably being the next riskiest, alts being the most risky. Right? So as long as you kind of understand that exposure pendulum, and I think taking profits will kind of come naturally if you can kind of just literally focus on valuations. I think honestly focusing a little bit less on what Bitcoin's doing and a little bit more on kind of alt valuations, both in terms of ETH and coins like Mu, which are kind of a nice guide. That's kind of really it, guys. Holding less coins, understanding exposure, and moving slow and taking profits according to how things are valued. As long as you literally understand exposure, I think that honestly tools you or kind of gives you a good enough understanding that you also know when to scale out. And if you don't scale out, you understand how much risk you're still holding, right? So obviously every single day I'm going to kind of walk through what I think in terms of how they're valued, how I'm scaling out or how aggressive I'm still being. But understanding exposure is the biggest thing. So whether or not you're with me, whether or not you're on your own, understanding that I think is massive. So that's kind of the biggest takeaways there. If anyone has any other questions about other lessons or other kind of alt cycle things you want to talk about past this video, I'm happy to kind of add those into the daily streams. I just wanted to really kind of focus on, a previous alt cycle study full video. I know we're a day or two late on this, but I want to do it right. I wanted to actually go down the list and have a full study. So hopefully that made some sense. Happy to kind of dive into some other lessons or other things I talked about. The one thing that I'm doing a little bit different with this alt cycle, and I said I would talk about this, was in terms of small caps. So at the beginning of kind of this abbreviated alt cycle back here in December, I talked about kind of building out, this is when I really thought about building out a different investment portfolio separate from a trading portfolio, right? And the reason I did that was, I want kind of some positions, I don't want me to making any decisions with them. I want them to be fully kind of devoted to catching this larger trend, right? To catching this full alt cycle. I don't want to be moving in and out on any of those, right? It's just kind of a way to diversify, not only in terms of coins, but in terms of strategies. So I wanted one strategy that was fully committed to waiting. And what I did there was I kind of built a core portfolio of some lower risk coins. It's Litecoin, Monero, Ethereum Classic, ETH, and kind of set those aside and said, I know those coins will be around. Maybe it's not the most upside, but I know that I'm not worried about them disappearing. I want to hold on to them for 6 months. Kind of what I want to do a little bit different and I do believe this, that alts are going to continue trending higher, and that this really is kind of an alt season, whether or not it only lasts for a month or two. Maybe historically speaking, it'll probably last until May or June if things kind of are the same as history. Anyways, the thing that I'm doing a little bit different, instead of kind of building into, maybe let's say 5 or 6, larger cap coins, or larger cap or safer coins, is instead of kind of shifting money there, I'm putting some money into kind of a smaller cap or riskier kind of holding portfolio. And I did this last time kind of in this shortened alt cycle with some alts on Cryptopia. I did it, a couple coins off ED, and kind of moving into those smaller cap or riskier, maybe even like 5 of those positions make up maybe one alt trading position. These are really small, positions, guys. But holding on to a few of those, and we've already seen this with Tomo and Loom, do your own research on those. Seriously, you have to, especially seeing kind of the scandal that we just saw on Veal yesterday. If one of those can 3, 5, 10x, and we've seen it a few different times, that's a massive win. And in these alt cycles, kind of the rising tide really does lift all boats, right? And I've seen some of these small caps, Dubai Coin and a few other ones, really do like 3, 4, 5x's for us in the past. I'm not saying that's going to happen again or for that specific coin. I'm just saying that's kind of the one different thing that I'm doing this season, is instead of kind of building into those core, which also did well, right? Holding ETH and Monero and those things also did well. But what I kind of want to do, I want to allocate that small chunk instead of kind of to an investment or holding portfolio. I'm putting it into a smaller cap, kind of riskier portfolio, and letting that thing kind of sit for 2 or 3 months, assuming that some will go to zero and assuming hopefully that a couple go 3, 5, 6x. Right? So that's the one kind of approach that I'm taking differently. Definitely tilting it a little bit towards a higher risk exposure, but that's what I'm comfortable doing this time. That's what I've seen work for some other people. And kind of as I continue to kind of fine tune my approach, my understanding, that's what I want to try out this time. So definitely not advice to do the same, just sharing with you guys what I'm doing. And that's all I really have, guys. If you have, I hit all my bullets, kind of talked about that one point. If you guys have any other questions about that, I'm happy to kind of do a different study. If you want to look at something else in terms of alt seasons, if you have specific questions, ask me in the market update. Today, I'll be in the group the rest of the day.